Hello. I want to welcome you all to today's event. And so this is a continuation of a conversation that we started in the fall when Kevin Gannon came and talked about inclusive pedagogy. And so Leslie watched Kevin's talk. And so in some ways, this is a sequel, although we also gave her permission to take this in whatever direction that she wanted to. So in some ways, this is really emerging from her and her work. Martha's going to introduce her in a second. But before she does that, I want to invite you all to join us on the back channel on Twitter. If you are on Twitter, you can use hashtag DOOO, which stands for hashtag domain of one's own. Hashtag D3Os. If you want to follow along on the back channel, I'll also let you know that this is being live streamed and recorded. So if you have colleagues that would be interested in this, I've tweeted out the link, and then I'll also share the link with folks by email after the fact. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, everybody. I am incredibly delighted and honored to introduce today's speaker and my friend, Leslie Madsen. I have known Leslie for over 10 years through professional circles, and I first met her in 2007 at an EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative conference when she was in the audience for a presentation given by Steve Greenlaw, Jerry Slazak, and myself. And while she was asking a particularly insightful question that I still to this day mull over, Leslie revealed a fact about herself that has become a funny cornerstone of our friendship. She actually attended Mary Washington College for one semester, her freshman year in 1993, meaning her and my time at MWC overlapped for a mere 3.5 months. So I like to dream about what could have been. But alas, Leslie transferred to Grinnell College, where she earned a BA in English, and from there, her professional career has traversed a diverse and multidisciplinary path. She earned her master's in creative writing and a PhD in cultural studies at the University of California, Davis, and she has worked as a writer, an editor, a museum assistant, a pedagogy and technology specialist, and most recently as an assistant professor of history and the director of the Idea Shop at Boise State University. As an academic, Leslie identifies as a public historian, focusing in part on the ways in which history is done, both in and outside of the academy. And much of her historical research has focused on the role of women in shaping our public understanding of natural history and science. In addition, she has also become an important voice in the conversation about the role of technology in our academic institutions, with a particular interest in mobile learning and accessibility. At Boise State's Instructional Design and Educational Shop, or the Idea Shop, Leslie and her team help faculty understand the theory and practice at the intersection of pedagogy and technology. On a personal note, I would just like to say that Leslie has been a very bright star in my own professional universe. She has a clarity of vision and a commitment to thinking deeply and critically about the work that we do that helps me to center my own work. And I just want to thank her for 10+ years of friendship and collegiality that she has offered me. Today, she'll be talking to us about teaching in the age of disaster. And while the title may seem deliberately provocative, I know that many of us are looking for ways to teach forward through larger institutional, political, and cultural contexts that can often feel disastrous. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Madsen.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your kind words, Martha. I really appreciate it. Right back at you. So, and I apologize for being from the podium, but until they make women's clothes with pockets, it's not happening. I'm just so delighted to be here today. I'm such a big fan of the work that the DTLT and UMW are doing at the intersection of pedagogy and technology, especially the Domain of One's Own, Digital Storytelling 106, and the Digital Knowledge Center. So you all here have amazing resources, and I hope that you're taking full advantage of them because great people are behind them. So to get started, you may have noticed that we are living in an age of disaster. There have always been disasters, let me be clear, but they're accelerating. Mass migrations, epidemics, terrorism, gun violence, particularly in our schools, climate change. And I'll argue that while students in some disciplines like social work or environmental engineering or public health and maybe even ethnic and gender studies might get some training on how to respond to mitigate or try to prevent some of these disasters, the vast majority of faculty in the core liberal arts sciences, core liberal arts and sciences are not yet teaching to this existential test. At the same time, I believe very fervently that a liberal arts education ought to be world-changing and world-saving. So I'm going to assume you know what's at stake. I'm not going to be Al Gore and show you, all the scary stuff, and I'm not going to get on a jig lift and go up to the ceiling, though next time I know, was that an option? So I'm not going to elaborate on each form of disaster and then talk about how each discipline, should address them. I'm not going to discipline-splain to you, but I am going to assume that each of you believes in the value and utility of a liberal arts education, and that you do know that there's a lot at stake, that we are really, truly facing an existential crisis in the United States and globally. So I'm going to talk today about a few ways we can prepare our classrooms, our departments and units, and our institutions for what's at stake, as well as some ways we can get started in reframing liberal arts education for the current era. So before I get to the heart of my talk, I want to lay out my two-part argument so that when you feel lost in one of my divagations, you can trust me that we're going someplace. So part one of my argument, and I promise this is the most well, maybe not, you'll see on a slide. So the first part of my argument is this: because we live in an age of disaster, we need to be graduating creative, courageous, resilient, and resourceful humans, even more so than we have before. And if we're going to survive, we need every brain, every perspective, every voice, every body. We need to be sure to welcome everyone, even people who to us might be unfamiliar or strange. And once they're here at our institutions, we need to be sure that they have everything they need to be contributing members of our community. So our biggest obstacle to this inclusion, to this full participation, whether we recognize it or not, is that too many of us, and I fall into the same trap, often imagine the default student to be the kind of student we'd expect at the middle of the last century. So a student who is white. I mean, if we look around the room, it seems like, well, yeah, the students are going to be white. Middle class, able-bodied, and either male or female. So I'm arguing today that our biggest problem in most institutions is actually an implicit white supremacy. Now, there are close runners-up: ableism, gender, homophobia, class issues. But for today, we're going to really focus on white supremacy. Second part of my argument is this: we need to address these white supremacies in every unit and at every level of the organization. And that teaching in the age of disaster requires us at once to reinvest deeply in the liberal arts, in our creative and generous and connective humanity, and to rethink their connections to skills and knowledge and vocation. So finally, before we really dive in, I wanted to provide you with a roadmap for this talk because it's going to feel wide-ranging, but at its heart, it's about this. Despite our best intentions, most of our institutions aren't as welcoming or inclusive as we need to be. I'm going to share some of my own experiences and observations as a student and a faculty member to highlight how we're falling apart. And just a heads up, I'm a humanities person. This is a very qualitative talk. I'm not going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. I just trust that you all can find the IPEDS database and look at the numbers yourself when it comes to who are we retaining, who are we graduating, and what are their demographics. So I'm going to take a deeper dive then into how we've invested in white supremacy. And by this, I don't mean that we're neo-Nazis or neo-Confederates or, espousing the ideologies of the Aryan nation. What I mean is that we live in a nation that has long privileged white people and their cultural practices over people of color. This narrowness of thinking not only alienates students, including increasingly many white students who are woke or waking up, but it's also artificially constrained our course content, our student life, and in some cases, it's disincentivized faculty to pursue institutional change initiatives and work in the community. And I can give you some examples of that as well. And then, for the brief interactive section, we will brainstorm some ways to reverse this white supremacist thinking, as well as other forms of exclusivity and discrimination. And then I'll talk about one emerging philosophy that I'm very excited about that we can adopt or adapt to prepare our students to address and even lead change in the age of disaster. And we'll consider how you might use it in your courses. Sound good? All right. So I'm going to start in what may be an odd place by sharing my own story, by sharing how in the 1990s, one institution alienated me by excluding others. I may inadvertently center my whiteness here because I'm talking from my own experience, but it will illustrate my point. This was the actual course catalog. I was so delighted to find it online. So I came to Mary Washington College as a first-year student in August of 1993. I could talk your ear off about why I came here and what happened once I did. Suffice it to say that I was looking for a very different aesthetic experience than my enormous, squat, razor wire topped high school surrounded by fences in Long Beach, California. The high school itself wasn't bad. In fact, it was extraordinary. But I wanted a dramatic change in the way that perhaps only a naive 18-year-old wants it and thinks that she can get it. It was my first time leaving home, and I had watched all of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, which premiered when I was in high school. Man, I was watching that every night, and then I read all of Shelby Foote's books, and I got deep into the Lost Cause narrative. Not that I really bought into it, but I was fascinated by the things people believed. And so I thought, I'm gonna study American history and literature in the 19th century, and what better place to do that than Fredericksburg, Virginia? So I visited, and I was wowed by Mary Washington's lovely campus, its historically significant location, and yes, its price. It was cheaper for me to go 4 years here than to pay in-state tuition in California for an impacted major for a 5 or 6 year undergraduate career. When I visited the campus in the spring of 1993, the people who knew me best, my parents, and especially my mom, said, "Wow, I can really see you fitting in here. The students look just like you." So that should have been a giant red flag to me, but I wasn't savvy or mature enough to understand why. While I knew on an intellectual level I valued diversity and social justice, I was just beginning to realize how uncomfortable, how aware of my whiteness I was around large groups of white people. So my high school, to give you a comparison, was 20% white, 20% African American, 20% Asian, 20% Pacific Islander, and 20% Latinx. A little different from Mary Washington in 1993, which was 95% white and 5% black. So right now in my head, as I share that statistic, I can hear the alarm bells going off and the red siren, the lights spinning, whoop, 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 you know? But they were silent when I most needed them to alert the younger version of me that like, maybe this isn't for you. So let me give you a few glimpses into my experience. And I want to make very clear that like I don't believe these things about Mary Washington today. It's been 25 years. We're in the 21st century. There are cool people here. But at the time, there were certain practices and traditions that were deeply alienating to me. And I'll tell you also why I'm talking about them in a moment. So I showed up on campus in late summer 1993 and saw Confederate flags in the windows of some students' dorm rooms. And I began to realize, hey, that's not really a heritage, not hate thing, no matter what Shelby Foote said in that documentary and in his books, right? It's not really about Southern history and pride. There's other stuff going on there. And so whenever I walked through campus and I'd see flags in dorm rooms or on people's cars, on bumper stickers or other places, I just began to grit my teeth and my jaw, and I'd grumble to myself, like, you know. I was that person. And this actually, as you may know, is from 2018. So it's still a problem here. And then the resident assistant on the second floor of Virginia Hall assured us when we first arrived that campus was very safe, even at night, but told us first-year women that we should not venture to the other side of the tracks. So I was like, oh, what's over there? And so I walked over there, and I've taken a couple of maps of current-day Fredericksburg, which is not that different from, in terms demographically, in terms of what I saw in 1993. So the dotted black line I've added are the railroad tracks. Mary Washington is at upper left, that rectangle. And then down lower, for those of you who live in there, you'll know that's the Mayfield neighborhood. And on the left, the map on the left, the purple is African American, and the lighter colors are not African American. And then over on the other side, it is areas that are white are purple, and then you can see very clearly that the Mayfield area is African American. So what I learned when I walked over there, I learned that safe connoted here a white space, while dangers lurked in the African American neighborhood of Mayfield. Then I was astonished, sorry for the stock photo, then I was astonished when a few African American women who lived on my floor once came down the hall to explain to me, a young white woman, that certain ways my black roommate had acted recently weren't representative of all black people. We're not all like that, one said. I assured them that I knew that, but I was kind of stunned. They felt the need to tell me, to explain that to me. And I thought, well, they must think that because I've met this one woman that I'm going to extrapolate from her behavior, right? And assuming that I had never met any African-American people, and that their experience, you know, a white person meeting one black person who is a bit odd is enough to turn them into a racist. It made me feel really sad for them. So while I was grappling with all of this intellectually, I felt it in my body. I became depressed and homesick. I went to one counseling session, and when I tried to schedule another one, I was told that the counseling center was booked up for the rest of the semester, and that was in week 2. So I was like, oh, there's some dark stuff going down here. But the other way I felt it in my body is that I learned the hard way as a young vegetarian that Southern cuisine, including that served in Quebec, integrates a lot of undisclosed animal products. I had regular food poisoning and I lost 20 pounds my first semester. So, long story short, for these and other reasons, I left Mary Washington in December 1993. I felt like a huge failure. And in fact, walking across the campus, I came here for Digital Pedagogy Lab a couple of years ago, I was just bawling because I really wanted this to be the place for me. And it was just so alienating. And I still felt it 25 years later. And right even now, I'm like, oh. So I felt like a huge failure. I mean, it was the first the first big decision of my adult life. And I blew it in like a phenomenal way, right? I picked the absolute wrong region of the country for me to go to. So I, a white, middle-class, high-achieving, able-bodied woman whose parents had graduate degrees, was supposed to succeed in this context. This was a system built for people like me, and one at which my entire K-12 life had been aimed, and it felt as if I were on the wrong planet. If I felt out of place, imagine how our first-generation students, students of color, students with disabilities, and students facing precarity must have felt. Honestly, I can't even imagine how the African-American women living in my dorm must have felt when they saw the Confederate flags in the dorm room windows and heard our RA tell us not to go to the other side of the tracks. So I transferred to a city college and then an elite liberal arts college in the Midwest that more clearly aligned with not only my own values, but with my entire sense of the world. It wasn't always a comfortable place, far from it, but, and here I'm going to be painfully blunt, I discovered, who knew, that I fit better at an institution named after an abolitionist who sheltered John Brown than at one named for a woman who enslaved people. So let me reflect on this. What happened? Why did I feel alienated? There were institutional cultural traditions that just didn't resonate with me, that were so foreign in terms of the habits, beliefs, and values I saw underlying them that they made me feel my outsider status even more. Mary Washington was not and is not alone in having traditions I don't understand. That's kind of the point of traditions, isn't it? To build community, to delineate community, to traditions are how we integrate students so that they feel part of the community, part of the institution and its history. To quote marketing pioneer and author Seth Godin, people like us do things like this. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about how this has played out in your experience as students and faculty. But to model what I'm looking for, I'm going to share 3 disparate traditions, large and small, and here I'll stop picking exclusively on Mary Washington and share some other institutions, from 3 different institutions where I've been a student or faculty. And then I want you to be ready to think about or jot down some examples from your own life. So I was puzzled by the Mary Washington College honor system because, again, I had watched the Civil War documentary and I had read Shelby Foote's 3-volume series, and man, I knew what honor meant in the South. It was duels. It was gentleman's honor, and for women, honor in the South meant virtue or chastity. And so I was like, okay, this is culturally really complex, and yet every time I turn in a paper or a quiz, I'm supposed to write pledged in full and sign my name, which also tells me like the institution doesn't trust me. Why isn't it trusting me? It doesn't like, and it was framed as this moral thing instead of an ethical thing, and the institution trusted that I had enough of a moral compass to maintain academic integrity and to trust me. The faculty could walk out of the room while I was taking a test as long as I signed my name to it, but God forbid I have a young man in my room after 10 p.m., right? My moral compass was corrupt there, right? I needed to protect the university needed to protect, or the college then needed to protect my honor as a woman. So there was just a lot going on there. The college was, on the one hand, claimed to trust us implicitly in certain arenas and then to act in loco parentis, in the place of our parents in others. And I was like, what is going on here? So that was a bit bewildering. And this is the honor system from that catalog year that I enrolled. This one's fun. Has anyone ever seen a fistulated cow? Yeah. Sorry. So I did most of my graduate work, as Martha mentioned, at UC Davis. And they have this annual event called Picnic Day, where all of the departments put on basically a show for the public. Prospective students come, alumni come. It's a big event. The campus is 5,800 acres, so there's it's huge. There's just stuff happening everywhere. But one of the highlights people told me about is you have to go see the fistulated cow. And I was like, and I never did, because when I looked it up, I was like, no, that's not something I need to see. And yet, here I am showing all of you. So what a fistulated cow is it's a cow that has a hole in its side, and there's actually a plug that goes into that hole. And it's so that veterinarians, when they're caring for cows, if there's a cow that has like bad bacteria in its gastric juices, they can actually scoop some out of one cow and put it into another cow. So that makes sense, I guess, if you're a cow person. But what they did at Picnic Day is they were like, hey, stick your arm in this cow and feel it digesting. I was like, people like me do not do things like that. So, and again, everyone talked about the fistulated cow, the fistulated cow. All right. The third one I'm going to tell you about is much more common, and it's college football. So I work at a little institution called Boise State, which you may have heard has a football team. Every time I mention Boise State, people say something about potatoes and something about the Smurf turf. So there's blue grass on the football field. And I've never quite understood college football, and I understand less each year why institutions feel it's a good idea to have young people bash their brains together in ways that we know lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, early death, suicidal ideation, violence against women. I mean, it's the whole thing, right? And it's for entertainment. We don't even pay the people who do this. So Boise State then, on top of this, sells licensed football merchandise that says, "Attack the future." And I'm like, what does that mean? And I ask people, even in my least exasperated voice, very nicely, I will ask people at Boise State, hey, what does attack the future means? And the most they can tell me is, it's something that our football coach used to say. I'm like, yeah, but what does it mean? And they just look at me like I've lost my mind, as if it's so obvious. So with football, I feel complicit in something barbaric whose cultural appeal and contours I just don't understand, and it angers me and alienates me from my institution. And one of the reasons I picked Mary Washington is not a lot of football. So I want you now to take a moment to think about, and ideally write down, if you have a pen, some traditions, or on your phone in the Notes app, some traditions from college, grad school, or higher ed institutions where you've worked that you found foreign, odd, or off-putting. They might be campus-wide traditions, or something in a smaller group, department, or community of which you were a part. Think about why you couldn't relate to them, and think about for whom they were created and why they continued to be practiced. So I'll give you a minute just to jot down some things, and then I'll cue you to turn to the people around you and share what your thoughts are on this. So again, a tradition or an activity that you found off-putting or odd. All right, go ahead and turn to the people next to you and ask them about what they wrote. And in some cases, your nearest person may be behind you. Okay, so let's go ahead and reconvene. So is there anyone who would like to share something they heard or something that they wrote down?
Hi. So this is actually about UVA over in Charlottesville. Okay, so it's annoying because I forget what it's called, but so my brother went there, and it happens as soon as all the freshmen move in. It happens every year, and it's on this row of frat houses. And I was walking past it with my brother when we were helping him move in his junior year. And I saw all of these like freshman girls, and you could tell they were freshmen because they were like super excited to go to all these like house parties where people were like visibly intoxicated, and like there was trash everywhere. And mind you, this is like 11 in the morning already. And I asked him, I was like, what is this about? And he was like, yeah, it's kind of this tradition. Like, most people will end up really sick tomorrow. Like, he had some friends that had to like go away in ambulances after this his freshman year, and it's like a whole nightmare. But this happens every year. And actually my dad went there in the 80s, so you know. And it was even bigger back then. But this has continued, and my brother only just graduated, so just it happened like 2 years ago.
That's a really good example.
Yeah, to kind of jump off that, I'm from a big college town. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, for Florida State University. And I think it was last year that they had such a big frat party that a freshman got severe alcohol poisoning to the point where he actually died. And two of the people in the fraternity, I think he was a pledge, just ignored him. And then their dads got them out of it. And that's just something that does not sit well with me. So I've never supported Greek life in any way because I've always had this sense, but that really just...
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that I'm hearing stories of Greek life here, right? That you intentionally choose to come to a place that's not that.
I didn't know you then, but I was teaching here. I came here in '86, and there was a student tradition called Woe Man. Was that here when you were here? Had you heard of Woe
I don't
Man?
remember that. Martha does.
We had only had men at this school for 15, 16 years at that point. They started coming in 1970. But by 1986, 1987, when I got here, there was an annual contest where men would dress up as women on the stage in Dodd Auditorium. And I never went to it, so I'm not quite sure what they did, but I know it was humiliating to women. They were making fun of women. And one of them would be elected the Woe Man of the Year. And I believe that we, as I said to Steve, I think that Carol Corcoran and I, running the Race and Gender Project, were instrumental in stopping that.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. All right, I'm going to move back onto the presentation, but we'll have some other opportunities for you to be involved. Thank you. So, and I'm not going to ask you to share these quite yet, but I want you now to think about things you encounter on your current campus. Yes, at Mary Washington, and for those of you watching the live stream, whatever your current institution is, where you work or teach, or a student, that may alienate people who are not like you. So that was an excellent example, right? So here's a man saying, well, this was really insulting to women, right? So can you think about those kinds of activities or traditions, right? So, and when I say that these practices may be alienating, what I mean is that they render these people that you're thinking about and their concerns invisible. They might push them to other institutions, or they might cause them actual harm. So take a minute to reflect and to just write down one of those. And I know that this is a lot harder than the things I really don't like exercise. All right, so we'll consider that piece in a little while. But I want to talk about the hidden and not so hidden, as promised. It's the juicy part, the white supremacies and other forms of structural discrimination in our departmental and institutional cultures. So I've worked or been a student at 8 different institutions. and I've taught in 8 different disciplines. So I'm not just talking about Mary Washington. I'm not just talking about my current institution. Don't try to nail me down here. So I have more than a dozen examples that I could pull up, but I'm just going to share 3 with you as examples, because then I'm going to ask you to come up with others, and I don't want to take yours. Okay. So the first of these is language requirements. So as an English major, I was expected to take, at least at the institution I graduated from, I was expected to take a foreign language, a world language. And we expect at Boise State, here I am naming the institution already. I'm glad I have tenure. We expect our graduate students in particular to have some kind of familiarity with a foreign language, right? But we only require 1 year of it. How many of you have taken 1 year of a foreign language and feel like, yeah, I got this. I can go into the archives and dig around and really come to some illuminating connections? Yeah. It'd be pretty gutsy if you raised your hand right now. We're sending our students really inconsistent messages there about the value of other cultures, right? And about fluency. Because we're not requiring them to take a sufficient number of courses to gain any kind of fluency, or even to say, hey, you know, you've reached the point in your language study where you actually start talking about the culture and the history of this region that uses this language, rather than just, you know, grammar, yeah, conjugating verbs. So we also, in the history department at Boise State, only on a case-by-case basis accept sign language as the language that students can use, which is kind of ridiculous because we have a public history master's where students may actually be interviewing people who are deaf, who may be doing projects about people who are deaf, and the fact that we don't count that has always been puzzling to me, and I've pushed really hard against it, and I get a lot of pushback on that. The second one is near and dear to my heart. So this is true not just at my current institution, it's true everywhere I've been. We think pretty narrowly about what counts for tenure and promotion. We tend to count things that are for white audiences, so top-tier peer-reviewed journals, right? Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, my discipline's very global, and there are people of color who read it. I'm thinking about, I admit, I'm thinking in a US context here. For white communities, for example, talks at the Rotary Club or Chamber of Commerce, and white students. So, for example, my department currently gives a lot more workload points if you serve on the graduate council committee rather than other committees. And our graduate college is largely white. So if we really were interested in diversity and inclusion, we would not only count but value highly service and teaching activities that contribute to the recruitment, retention, and graduation of all students, of students of color in particular, as well as publications in non-traditional venues. So with regards to those kinds of non-traditional venues, which might be exhibits, they might be websites, they might be a podcast, it might be guerrilla museum tours, we remain unimaginative about alternative methods of peer review and think too narrowly about impact. So, for example, just taking time to rework your courses so that they use open educational resources and are more affordable and accessible to your students, does that count as much as an article in a peer-reviewed journal, even though it takes more time often than to publish an article in a peer-reviewed journal and might actually have more people interacting with those materials than your article in a peer-reviewed journal? Typically, that's not worth as much at a lot of institutions as the peer-reviewed research in the journal. If you go and you talk to the local black church about your research on HIV and AIDS and the applications for that community, which has a higher rate of AIDS than other communities, particularly among gay men, does that count more or less than getting a paper accepted at your disciplinary conference on the same topic? Typically, the latter counts more than the former, right? So we need to be thinking, you know, how are we thinking about impact? And then finally, as I was doing research on the honor system and honor councils, I found that a lot of colleges are finding that the honor systems and the honor codes are inequitably applied, and that students of color are charged and sanctioned more often than are white students, even when those students are very, very underrepresented at the institution, and that those students tend not to serve on the honor councils. So, you know, at every level of the institution, we often find problems. So I'm not going to belabor my point by pointing out the solutions to each of these problems, as in most cases they're really obvious. You know, do the opposite of what we're doing now, and encourage participation by those traditionally excluded. But what I would like to take a moment to have you reflect and see if anything on my list sparked similar thoughts for you of ways you or your own department, or if you're a student, your student club, your dorms, your life outside of your classes or in your classes, privileges whiteness or inadvertently, and God, I hope it's inadvertently, buys into white supremacist thinking. So again, take a moment to jot those down. Then just as soon as you have some written down, turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. And while you're talking, I'd like you to come up with one concrete step you, your colleagues, or your administration might take to remedy these issues so that we're more welcoming of all students, faculty, and staff. And remember earlier I asked you to think about people who are unlike you. This is a good time to revisit what you had written down then. Again, as soon as you have one, go ahead and turn to the people next to you and share. And again, we're looking for one concrete step you or your colleagues or the administration could take to remedy some of these issues of inequity. All right, does anyone have any ideas, concrete steps that they're brave enough to share? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We were just talking about the idea of unpaid internships, which is brought up a lot in today's society. But the idea of the people who can afford to take on unpaid internships typically are privileged and have support elsewhere, whereas the people who really need the experience can't really afford to take on an unpaid internship because they have to make money doing other things. And in terms of concrete steps, like Steve mentioned, sometimes you just have to find the money, but when that comes, you have to take it from somewhere else. So you have to make it a priority to pay people.
That's an excellent example. Often, too, the ways that our institutions structure work study may work for or against it. And my institution recently restructured the way that work study funds work so that it used to go to a unit, so every unit was allocated a certain amount depending on their need for student employees, and then we would recruit students who qualified for work study. Now the money travels with the student. So what that does, it's great for the students because suddenly there's this wage increase, right? Because we're all competing. Well, we'll pay you whatever, you're bringing the money with you. But it also means that you can't count on having the same number of student employees or student funding that we used to have in the past. So concrete steps there. I mean, you could ask, hey, when you do your annual fund drive, can you ask people specifically to contribute money to an internship fund for the library or for wherever? Who else would like to share?
Here you go. Yay.
My basic point here is the austerity with which faculty, and it stems off of that a little, the austerity with which faculty are expected to live. And I bring this up when I've been here 4 years, and when I came here, I had a baby and a young, like a 3-year-old, and there's no childcare here and no expectation of it. When I brought it up, it was kind of like, yeah, that's a great point, but no. And then I just think about, I'm obviously who I am, and I have family in the general area, so I could lean on them a little bit. But if you move here, you're a single parent. There's no way that you could make it on the salary that we pay, and then the lack of childcare and the lack of any family services or anything like that. So, and
Yeah.
I guess the solution is increase salaries and
Right. Well, or
provide a plethora of family services.
yeah, and get state legislatures to reinvest in education. So many of them cut back during the latest recession, and also I would like to point out too that it would be great if faculty, as someone who has moved from a full-time faculty position into a hybrid faculty professional staff position where I'm paid 12 months instead of 9 months now, suddenly to some of my colleagues I'm a sellout, right? Because I make more money than they do. And when I asked about promotion to full, they're saying, well, you have other avenues. You have monetary avenues of reward. So let's not drag each other down. Let's not say, oh, you're an administrator and you sold out. Let's say faculty are underpaid and need to be paid as much as people elsewhere. But I absolutely agree with you. It's the faculty salaries are shameful.
Can I share one? This isn't mine. It stems from a conversation with a student who I've been working with about, and it ties into student representation. And I think this happens at lots of institutions that are trying to build representation on their campus, that those students end up feeling like tokens that get used again and again. This school kind of brings them out to use as photos in publications, but also in other ways too. And I think the solution to that is that those students need to be included in a conversation, a really open conversation about their role at the institution and how they themselves feel about representation. I think very often we just assume that that they don't want to be a part of that conversation, and in my conversations with them, they do.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So I know some of you are like, wait, wasn't this talk supposed to be about teaching the liberal arts? Was this a bait and switch? Yes, but not a bait and switch. Sorry. Yes, it was supposed to be about teaching, but institutional cultures and the things that we do, the moral stances and values we champion, the practices we privilege or devalue influence our teaching. And so this whole conversation is part of teaching and learning at the institution. So we had some candidates for president of Boise State come talk last week. And there was one woman from UC Santa Cruz, Marlene Tromp, who has written a book on the Titanic. And when we asked her about diversity and inclusion, she said, yeah, you don't want to be like the Titanic. And we're like, yeah, that sounds bad, right? But she explained what was going on, which is that the Titanic had people from all over the world, passengers from all over the world on it. And the reason, Trump said, was because they advertised in all of these different languages, and they got people on the ship, and people were having a great time until it hit the iceberg and all of the safety and evacuation instructions were in English, right? So it's a prime example, a literal life and death example of a moment where people are like, yeah, we're inclusive, everybody's welcome, and then screwed them over in a huge, huge way, right? And as Trump pointed out, there were enough lifeboats to save every woman and child on that. And there were families with 8 children who went down because their parents could not read the instructions, right? And I mean, this even putting aside illiterate and semi-literate native English speakers. So I'm going to argue that the liberal arts are what will save us in this age of disaster, and that will also save us from the various perils that I've been talking about, particularly around race and ethnicity and white supremacy. Because really what we need right now is a fusion of the best of the liberal arts tradition, by which I mean the ways we, synthesizing various disciplines, content, theories, methods, lenses, and practices, can lead students to question parochial assumptions in their hometowns or their course materials or their state legislatures. I see this all the time in Idaho. I'm sure you see it here too, or whatever institutions you're at the live stream. But the liberal arts help students ask better questions and find more satisfying and meaningful answers. A liberal arts education allows students to develop that negative capability that Keats talked about, right? This idea that species of creative genius where you can embrace multiple perspectives without falling into relativism, but one in which a scholar or artist is, to quote Keats, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Sometimes you just need to sit with something like diversity and inclusion because it's, or climate change, because it's really, really hard to hold it all in your head at once. So negative capability is what happens when we meld diversity and inclusion with the interdisciplinary liberal arts. We recast old worlds and imagine new ones, and isn't that what we need in the age of disaster? So I'm going to quickly describe to you one approach that I found out about. I first heard about it about 18 months ago. I heard this term maker competencies, and I was like, oh, that sounds kind of bureaucratic and not very interesting. It's not a sexy term. But the way I found out about it is there was a multi-institution research project based at University of Texas, Arlington, and University of Nevada, Reno, run by Martin Wallace and Tara Radniecki. And they secured a Institute of Museum and Library Sciences grant to recruit faculty across the disciplines at several different institutions to incorporate these maker competencies into classes across the disciplines. And I was one of those faculty. So basically, maker competencies, or sometimes called maker literacies, are this collection of knowledge and skills related to ideation, creation, project management, collaboration, and sharing that students can use to solve the complex problems of the 21st century, regardless of discipline. In the resource document that I'll link to, it's on the last slide of this presentation, you'll find a link to all of the competencies the folks at UTA have identified, and they are legion, but here are a few. So the primary one is this idea that you're going to identify a need through empathy, by the way. You're not just going to be a white dude in Silicon Valley who's like, I need to get protein quickly. Let's develop Soylent. Everyone's going to love it, right? But then it gets into this granular, like, what tools are available to me? Which tools are ethical for me to use? Can I burn coal to make this? Maybe not the best idea, right? How do I produce prototypes? How do I get feedback on those prototypes? How do I iterate? How do I find a good team? What makes a good team? How can I get these people to buy in to my vision, and how can I listen to their visions? How can I take some sometimes really technical language of my discipline and translate it for a lay audience? How do I connect people who want to learn with those who actually have the experience? So how do I find the knowledge and networks? How do I be mindful of the cultural and economic and environmental impacts of what I'm doing? So am I culturally appropriating something? Am I polluting something? If I'm printing a bunch of stuff at the maker space, what happens to all that plastic, right? And then to weigh the costs and benefits of keeping one's intellectual property versus making it open. So you can imagine how these competencies would be useful in tackling challenges as diverse as coastal flooding, gun violence, extreme income inequality, the crisis on our southern border, and the polluted water in Flint, Michigan, all hallmarks of our age of disaster. So I integrated maker competencies into my upper division undergraduate course on the history of women in the Western United States. I think most students enter that course expecting to learn about pioneers, and then more pioneers, and some pioneers, and then maybe Native Americans. And some of those pioneers will be Mormon, because it's Idaho, so a little different maybe than what you might hear out here. And instead, my course introduces students to topics as multiracial families, such topics as multiracial families in the 19th and 20th centuries, Native American women's activism, the women in the Zoot who took part in the Zoot Suit riots, incarcerated people at Manzanar, and the differing expectations placed on girls and women depending on their various identities. So last spring, I added maker competencies to this course. And I asked students to create something physical or digital that captured some aspect of this broad history. I also asked them, because I need to level up and be a little bizarre, quite frankly, I asked them to start with or otherwise incorporate a pair of shoes selected for them by the Idaho State Historical Society from its museum collections. So I took the students to museum storage to the museum storage warehouse where they could touch the artifacts and look at them up close. And they included everything from work boots to fancy rabbit fur boots that you would put over your other shoes to keep your feet warm in the carriage if you were wealthy, to bound foot shoes to moccasins. And so the students handled them and sketched them. One student went full on like CSI. He had like his phone and he's like, the shoe weighs approximately 12 ounces. It was fabulous. And then some students brought these amazing camera rigs and were showing each other how to photograph these things. I had an instructional designer come and showed my students how to create 360-degree rotating views of these shoes. And it was a team effort. So I worked with Boise State's digital and makerspaces librarian, Amy Vecchione, and with a instructional designer from my department, Brian Martin, to explore the contours of what students might create and give them opportunities to practice hands-on making. So in the resources, I share a link to the assignment itself and to the rubric the students and I co-created to assess what was, I admit, a rather amorphous assignment. Now, the resulting projects completed by the students were, as we should expect, uneven. Some were amazing, others not so much. That said, I was surprised by the diversity of the students' responses to the assignment. So it was clear that because of the course's focus on the experiences of women of color, many students were thinking about more than just white women as they designed their projects, even though most of the shoes in the museum's collection had belonged to white women in Idaho. Students created mini documentaries, analyzed advertisements, developed a website about Western courtship and weddings, and created curriculum to help high school teachers more thoughtfully incorporate the experiences of women of color into the social studies curriculum. As you might imagine, my history students were less than enthusiastic when I told them at the beginning of the semester that we'd be undertaking an extended project on shoes, and B, I expected them to learn some new technological skills. That's not what you sign up for when you sign up for a history major. But by the end of the course, when I asked the students to reflect on these maker competencies, they really bought into the concept. Some of my students reported being able for the first time to understand and articulate some of the skills they were taking to the job market and what they called the real world, as if you and I don't live in a real world. So now, are a bunch of projects related to old shoes going to change the world and rescue us from the age of disaster? No, not directly. But these students began to think more broadly about the impacts they could have in the world, particularly in the K-12 classroom or through public history projects. They demonstrated new confidence in their abilities. They rated the course content and projects exceptionally highly, and they were excited to keep learning. So here at UMW, you already have far more structures in place than we had at Boise State a year ago to encourage your students to develop these maker competencies, right? You've got the Digital Knowledge Center, a great library, you have the DTLT, you have Domain of One's Own, and I'm sure lots of other projects that I haven't yet heard about. And so I want you to take a moment to consider how you might use local resources to help your students develop some of the maker competencies relevant to addressing and remediating the age of disaster. Okay? Take 1 minute, because I want to be cognizant of time, and think about how you might use these maker competencies in your course and in your discipline to help your students get ready to change the world. And I know it's a big question, but I suspect you are already thinking about some of these things. And that you're already doing some of these things, to be quite frank. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Yes, you're talking. Sorry. right, let's go ahead and reconvene. And I'm going to have you hold on to your ideas for a moment. In the interest of time, because I do want to get to the Q&A, I want to hear about your ideas at the reception or during the Q&A, but I wanted to just say a couple of things in closing. So there's so much still to do around diversity and inclusion of all kinds. You know, as faculty, as staff, and as students, as administrators, we'll never be able to control, for example, an RA's offhand remark about not going to the other side of the tracks, right? But we can do a better job of educating students, staff, and faculty about those kinds of microaggressions and how they harm individuals in the community and how they shape institutional culture. We looked at how we might reconsider practices, including language requirements and tenure and promotion, to bolster our commitment to inclusion and diversity, and to welcome people working in new, important, and meaningful ways. And we learned about one philosophy, maker competencies, that can help us think more intentionally about what knowledge and skills our liberal arts graduates are developing for the age of disaster. So as we move forward, I hope the bigger question you'll take away from this talk is this one. What stories do you tell yourselves and others about Mary Washington or whatever other institution you happen to be working at or attending? So their stories, you know, what stories do you tell yourselves? What stories do you tell others about the university? What are its most important traditions? Who's included in these stories and traditions? Who's absent from them? Who sees themselves reflected in these stories? I mean, with my example of the honor code, I completely understand if you're like, hey, it's working for us, and your perception of it is completely skewed because you're not from here, and you don't really understand our history and our culture. But then you need to own that and take a stand and say, this is valuable to us, and our institution may not be for you if you don't understand and buy into this core piece. But I also hope you'll see motifs and plot twists in these stories that may be profoundly off-putting or even harmful to students, particularly students of color, and that you'll rewrite those stories so that the institution is not only more welcoming for all students, but ready to prepare them to address the enormous challenges of our current era. Again, we don't want to be the Titanic, right? So if, as Seth Godin says, people like us do things like this, what does that mean to you? Who are the people like us in higher ed, and what do we do next? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll run around if folks have questions for Leslie or comments. What was that? Questions, comments.
Did I alienate everyone?
If anybody wants to share their ideas.
Yeah, I would love to hear your ideas too for your disciplines, for how you might integrate maker competencies or prepare students for this age.
I think one group we have forgotten are the staff people. I think of housekeeping a lot, and we spend money on a lot of things, but not those key people. That would include our office staff, and it would include our adjunct faculty. A lot of money has to come from somewhere to take care of that while we think about our salaries.
You are absolutely right. Thank you for including them. In fact, at every presidential candidate, Boise State had a failed presidential search last year, and at every candidate last year and this year, so 10 times, there was someone who worked for landscaping named Emilio who stood up each time and said, basically, what about us? What do you think about labor? And it was very telling in the way people answered those, the candidates answered his question. Most of them poorly.
This is a little off topic, but someone mentioned the lack of childcare facilities at Barry Washington. Where I taught before at Brown University, the childcare facilities run by the university were a profit-making concern. I mean, there was enormous competition among the faculty to get their kids into the childcare center, and it was not cheap tuition at all. So, you know, we have a lot of effort in this university to bring in income to the university. Perhaps this could be some kind of enterprise that would both bring in income and be a service to faculty with small children.
I like that idea. you just have to be careful how you price it, right? So that the housekeeping staff can afford it, right? I mean, a sliding scale seems very appropriate here, particularly if it's staffed by students for whom it's a learning experience as well. The problem I faced with that is that, you know, because of when I moved to Idaho, I took a pay cut, and while my salary on paper looked decent, the state withheld more for retirement than the UC system where I worked previously was, and so I was bringing home a lot less. I was bringing home about $27,000 a year, and the tuition was about $1,000 a month. And it was like, I don't know what to do. But I appreciated it being there, yeah.
I
Other
think also
questions?
recognizing the difference, the need for that is different for men and women. And what that conveys and what that signifies at the institution is different for men and women. I find myself including pictures of my baby in talks that I give, knowing that my audience will think, oh, how cute that he brings his baby in. And I know that that's not how my female colleagues feel when they bring that in. So even the use of the facility, even walking your kid to the facility that's on campus would be a very different experience for a man versus a woman.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, when we're thinking about inclusivity, I imagine it's less of a problem here because Virginia is just thick with colleges, but in Idaho, it's not. And so we have a lot of non-traditional students. And what are they supposed to do with their kids during classes, right? Sometimes they'll just bring them, right? So I think it's important to normalize the fact that children are going to be in a space and that not everybody can afford high quality professional childcare. One of the moments I most remember is when my dissertation advisor, when I was at UC Davis, was giving a talk, and she was wearing, her toddler was wandering around, and she was wearing her infant while she spoke in a Bjorn. And at one point, the infant started crying, and so she just started breastfeeding there while she's giving the talk. And I was like, this is awesome! This is gonna be my life! And it's not. But we need more people who are willing to do that. Other questions? Again, I'd still love to hear your ideas for how you think, how you might or how you are already educating your students for our current era.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about the language requirement. You may know that Mary Washington is considering changing that as part of our general education.
I did not.
Well, we are. And I'm actually on the fence about how I feel about keeping it as 4 semesters of language, because I'm not sure that gives you the cultural experience either. So I'm just curious what your opinion is about that.
So, well, I am always very happy to hold forth on things I know very little about. In this case, I'm going to say I really don't understand. I really don't know enough about, you know, the development of an undergraduate's brain in education, and I haven't looked at the studies of what happens if you take 2 semesters versus 4 semesters versus 6. But I will say that what I have seen among students when they're talking about their language classes, students who persist, is that they develop a really interesting cultural empathy, which in some place like Idaho, or I imagine here, and in the more red states, is really useful and much needed. So if you think about it not just as, are they learning a language well or not, but are they exercising different parts of their brain and their humanity, then you know, it really depends on what question you're asking and what outcomes you're looking for as to whether a certain number of semesters is sufficient.
I actually want to kind of respond to that because my first semester here, I took anthropology, and that totally changed the way I thought about the world and just learning about other cultures and my views on like gender and race. But I'm also an American Sign Language student. I take classes at Germana, and that's because like other languages, they don't really click well for me in my brain. Like other spoken languages, I was never good at. And my best friend, she's my age, but she is amazing at learning languages. Like she's majoring, she's in the Naval Academy, so she's majoring in Chinese and minoring in Japanese, and she can learn all of this stuff. But I recognize that different students like have better competency at learning different languages. And yeah, you can get more cultural experience from those language classes, but I feel like there should be a greater emphasis on those other cultural classes that are specifically for the culture. And we do have that requirement right now in our language or in our general education. So like classes like anthropology and sociology, I feel like those would be more effective.
That's a really good point. So again, it comes to what do you want the outcomes to be, right? Do you want students to have the experience of struggling, right, and learning another language, even though for some students it's a much greater struggle than for others, as you acknowledge, and develop the kind of empathy that we might have for immigrants or refugees who are coming here? Or do we want them to have fluency, or do we want them to get to know other cultures? So again, it really depends on what you want, what outcomes you're looking for there. But thank you to your point. And as someone with a PhD in cultural studies, I love it.
I was going to kind of add to what she was saying. As a student here at Mary Wash, who took previously Spanish courses in high school, I found that the way spoken, like the way that Spanish is taught as a dialect, doesn't necessarily translate into learning about the culture, as it does more of, here's a set of words in the language, here's what they mean in English, this is what's on the test. And it has not as much to do with the culture. And so going into it, if you're wanting to learn about the culture, then maybe not take a Spanish course at all, or a whatever course, whatever the language is, because that's not what you're getting out of the course. So to be more culturally empathetic, if that's the point of the language courses, it's not going to be the end result, or at least that's how I feel. I don't feel that I'll become more culturally aware of other cultures by learning a language.
That's a really good point. It depends on how these courses are taught, right? I mean, the language courses, and let me tell you, I took Spanish and French in high school. I switched because the Spanish teacher was really awful and I was going to have her another year, and I thought, I'm going to switch back to Spanish because that's the more useful language when I get to Mary Washington. And then I learned that they taught Iberian Spanish, not Yucatan Spanish, and so I'd have to learn a whole nother verb tense, or I was like, no, I can't. I have too much going on right now. I'm not going to master the Vosotros form, right? And so I just stuck with French. So, and then when I went to Grinnell, it was the same thing. Again, Spain Spanish, not Mexican or Latin American Spanish. So I stuck with French, but my French courses at Grinnell were about Algeria and about French colonialism and about World War II, and that they very much integrated the culture into our language learning. I learned more about colonialism in my French classes than I have at any other time in my life. So again, it really depends on what is being taught, right? I mean, you can teach students about colonialism with very tiny vocabulary, but it's the choice you make, right? How much progress do we want students to make in the course, and in what ways? So I'm sorry that your courses didn't really move you forward in that way.
I think there's a bit of a tension in this conversation, and in your talk even, between giving students space to make choices about their education and having those choices have the positive effects you're talking about, and also not having institutions relinquish their responsibility to convey what they value. And so the interesting thing with a language requirement is I can see from the student side that empowering students to make decisions about how to best meet these goals seems really important. But another thing is having institutions convey what they value to every single student that comes in. And in some ways, the curriculum is the currency of an institution. And so putting things in the curriculum says it conveys what we value.
Absolutely, and one of the things that happened at Grinnell, because I transferred around so much, I couldn't study abroad, but more than half, when I was a student at Grinnell, more than half the students studied abroad. And so if you didn't learn a language before you went abroad, you were going to be in trouble, because not everybody went to English language programs. And a lot of students went to African countries. And so this is another reason why diversity and inclusion is important, because those students, the college would pay the native language speakers from those countries and coach them on how to teach the students their native languages. So if you were going to Senegal, you could talk to a Senegalese woman and learn French as the Senegalese speak it, right? So this is, and when I took a French class, we had people from Morocco and Senegal and Algeria and Kenya, there's really something to be said, right? And again, you're not leaning on those people, hey, teach me your culture. You're saying, I'm going to pay you for your cultural knowledge, and we're going to really integrate this in ways that are meaningful there. So again, it depends on what the institution sees as the things it values. And I want to acknowledge that Grinnell is a private institution with more than $1 billion endowment. Not everybody can do that. Really, Jeff, yours is a little smaller? I'm so surprised.
We have time for about one more question, maybe two.
So I'll share something that I think is kind of like a maker competency, but then got squashed because of logistics. I teach intro to environmental science. So a lot of the students are not majors, they're taking it for their science. So I'm like, well, what can engage them? And what would be something they can take into the world? So I had them write an email about an issue to a representative or senator that would include statistics and research that they did. You know, like this many people have asthma and it's because of the particulate matter coming from coal power plants or whatever. And so I led them through the research, finding valid science sources and stuff. But the problem is my class size kept getting increased. And once it got past up to 65 students plus 2 other classes, I couldn't do that anymore for 65 students.
Yeah, that's a problem that we're all facing, right? And my solution to that for my own sanity is to get really, really good at group work, right? Because then you also have students talking to each other, right? And learning from each other, right? And then they can turn in an email that one of them can send, right, with all their names on it. And you only have to read, you know, if there's 3 students in a group, suddenly you're reading 20 emails instead of 65, right? It's not ideal, but it's possible. And I always, it took me so long to learn to do this. I've been teaching for almost 20 years now. But I always have the last project each semester be a group project, right? So that I have fewer projects to grade. Yeah.
I also think one of the hard things in that is letting go ourselves, because there's a sense in which when your students are in groups in a class or working in a group, it's like you want to be in every group at the same time, but you can't. You can sort of get the hum of the room, but you can't be an audience on every group's work. And sort of letting go and recognizing that a teacher, I don't have to be everywhere at all times. And suddenly when I have 60 students, I actually can't. But I think that that's hard for us to let go of when we're used to teaching classes of, if we're used to teaching classes of 15 or 20, where we could feel like we could be everywhere at all times. And the thing that I've done is similar to you, is letting their peers and their fellow students be the audience and taking away the responsibility of me always having to be the primary audience for their work.
Right. I think that's great. You also reminded me that in the, I'll share these slides with Jesse and Martha, but there's some additional relevant resources at that bit.ly link. And one of them is a PDF that lists various facets of white supremacist culture that you may not realize were white supremacist. Some of them I didn't. And one of them is individualism and the idea that individual effort is the most important effort. And so getting our students to work in groups, right? It's something they're gonna have to do a lot outside the university and collaborate with people. Is not necessarily the bad thing, even though it may seem that that makes it harder for us and it's unfair if they have a bad group member. That's kind of life.
Okay, so there's lots of time to continue conversation with Leslie. We have a reception on the 3rd floor of this building. Everyone is welcome to come. There's good hors d'oeuvres and appetizers there. It's on the 3rd floor in the digital gallery, which is on the other side of the building on the 3rd floor. So I hope you'll come and hang out with us and Leslie for about 30 or 45 minutes, or even just pop over for 5 minutes and say hello and scoop appetizers into your coat pockets.
You heard Jesse, they got the good stuff.
Yeah, they do.
So thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.